When Love Ends, Revenge Begins by Shelba R. Duran. Please like and subscribe Revenge YouTube channel. I have always trusted structure. I believed in schedules and backups, in the promise that a properly written algorithm could compensate for life's small, inevitable mistakes. My hands spoke the idioms of machines before they ever knew how to hold steady a nervous cup of coffee. I spent years translating human chaos into ordered logic at PractiPlan Mapping, where we made messy city grids and municipal nightmares neat enough to navigate. I liked problems with solutions. I loved results you could explain in a line of code. That's what made the discovery of Donald's betrayal a category error. An impossible exception thrown at the middle of a strategic program. It didn't fit. It shouldn't have happened. And since that is the case, the only solution I knew was to create a process, construct a protocol, and execute it until my intention met my output. Donald and I met at Penn State when the world reeked of cheap coffee and new books. He was an architecture major whose laughs were a key to unlocking other people's secrets, and I was the quiet engineering student who could sound off long paragraphs of pseudocode if necessary. He fell for me because I knew how to rig the coffee machine in our dorm, and I fell for him because he could draw perspective lines that seemed like they were windows into other lives. We got married when we were young, and stubborn and certain that the vows we made would be armor against life. It was on that faith that we built a life in Greensburg, a small house with a garden Donald tended like a museum, an essay of shared retirement plans, and the daily rituals people often misinterpret as evidence of contentment. His schedules had worked well within the parameters of our life together for 30 years. He ate the same kind of cereal, mowed the lawn on the same day of the week, drove to hardware stores along one familiar route. I felt the sameness was a type of security. Repetition is reliable. Repetition is comforting. So is repetition deceptive? It can conceal change just like a color can hide a pixel. It started with a small twitch. A phone set face down, differently hung shirts in the closet, the subtle scent of something floral that was not mine. I could have called it a day and filed these away in a virtual folder labeled suspicion. But suspicion is a bit like the equivalent of ignoring a bug in a program. Keep ignoring it and pretty soon it's systemic. One autumn afternoon, during a time when Donald was at cards, I opened his laptop. He pretty much always left the household tech to me, because I was better at passwords and worried about losing files. That trust was my access key. The emails were clinical in their clarity. Appointments, pledges, schemes. Patricia. New. Charming. Enthusiastic. My Donnie, she called him. He called her back with words that I would have long ago made rot my chest out of jealousy, but they just entered themselves as a log file. There were hotel reservations with credit card numbers, dinner receipts, and a chain of gushing texts that plotted a course away from our front door, and toward illicit afternoons and murmured evenings. For the first time ever I felt like the world had shifted in a way that no amount of debugging could put right. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I did what came most naturally to me. I closed the laptop and made tea, setting that knowledge aside like a dead battery for later use in the proper circuit. Grief and fury are not opposed to one another. They tend to be sequential. First is the visceral, hot grief of betrayal. Years of shared meals, of minor kindnesses that are the scaffolding of mutual trust, boiled down to a series of red flag transactions. Then there is anger's analytical edge, cold and crisp but razor sharp. The heart is not a very good tool. I allowed myself both. I let the grief sit in the room as if it were a cold guest, and then I allowed my mind to shift. My training hadn't equipped me for this type of wound, exactly, but it had been teaching me to think in systems, of predicting points of failure and engineering solutions to failure states. I adopted that approach to the man who betrayed me. I won't pretend that my plan was noble. Revenge rarely is. It's arithmetic of a sort, in which the injustice established is offset against another, and you must balance the ledger of wound and compensation until each side cancels out. I wanted for him to experience the erosion of what mattered most to him. His image of himself as a man above shame, his standing in his church, the kind neighbor who watered the lawn when the Rosenbergs went on vacation. I wanted him to get a taste of the bitterness of losing what he thought would be his clean and quiet escape from the duties of 30 years' worth of married life. I began quietly. The cracks that start off the smallest are often very effective because they grow in a stealthy way. I copied the emails and texts, placed them into neat PDFs that I could send with surgical anonymity. There was no way I was going to forward those messages directly. That would have been awfully crude of me. Instead, I stashed the evidence in places where social networks break out in punitive labor that is far harsher than anything legislation can do. A printed packet arrived, with no signature, at the office of the dental clinic where Patricia worked. Another envelope arrived, sloppily addressed, in the mailbox of a woman who was part of the bridge club that Donald occasionally referenced. The seed of rumors grows into a mold in wet corners. It took only days. My husband's name was a ripple on the still pond of my quiet town. Those who'd nodded to him on the street once again, now crossed over to the other side as if they could catch what he had. His face turned red while waiting in grocery store lines. Mothers looked the other way when he offered to help carry a package. The poker group, Donald's bastion of male camaraderie, started to rebook the nights, with scheduling conflicts, in their text messages. He called me seething, his voice thin with humiliation and something else that might have been panic. Why would anyone do that? Who would send that? He demanded. I could have snapped back. I could have mentioned his name, the woman's, and listened to the dam break. But I took a deep breath and told her, I'm not sure. Perhaps gossip has discovered a new pastime. I saw all over him studying my face for the tell that would give me away as the person who would cause his downfall. He didn't find anything, and that made him angrier. The path to finance was a logical next step. As you can probably guess, I'd spent enough nights helping him tally up his accounts, set everything to auto-pay and navigate spending. I was authorized to use some of his logins, trust that was now a liability. I had a few non-essential bills rerouted to addresses he hardly ever checked. I also tinkered with payment schedules to nudge small delinquencies into the seen side of credit reports. He was denied a personal loan he had applied for to assist a friend with a renovation. He described the project to me in the tones of someone proud of his capacity to be helpful, and granted rejection for reasons that only I could see. This is proportional to how carefully and deeply a man's sense of dignity has been built around his ability to provide. Donald's dignity cracked. I made sure not to break the man entirely. Dehumanizing feels just as psychopathic as it sounds. I didn't want to crush him, at least not beyond redemption. I wanted to pay back what he had given me, in a medium he could understand. Deceit. I wanted him to dwell in just the nervous, degrading life he had me dwelling in. Shaming is not the same at 70 as it was at 30. In youth, one can chalk it all up to adolescent irrationality or see the mistakes as character building. Reputations, after all, are even more fragile scaffolding by the time you get to our age. And dignity is harder to restore once the scaffolding has been destroyed. The game changer was when I went after his relationship with Patricia head-on. I hadn't hacked into her account. I had done something far more insidious and damaging. I'd manipulated perception, leveraging tiny scraps of digital déjà vu, GPS pings from a mutual device I had believed my private own, time-stamped shopping logs, and the suspicious juxtaposition of time-stamped emails and calendar entries. I pieced together an alternate story. I artfully threw it into the shade, though in a way that appeared nothing but accidental, and then represented him as seeming rather less attentive to her than I had seen him look. I changed the timestamps of messages, caused small gaps in responses, and inserted ambiguity into our chat. If someone doesn't trust the love they get, the quickest way to close them off is by hinting that their beloved isn't what he or she makes themselves out to be. Patricia was not malicious. She was eager and sunlit rather than Donald's cultivated shade. When skepticism found purchase, it spread like wildfire. Responses I read incorrectly. A text that seemed late but had been massaged by my hand. These were the wedges. She asked questions. He mumbled defenses. She expected clear answers and then, annoyed with the excuses, she left. The intimacy Donald lost was not merely a matter of physical meetings with Faith. It seems asshole rather that he had been building his life on sand. The cement of his circumstances crumbled when one had a flashlight turned upon it. I kept the outward rhythms of our house through everything. I kept on ironing his shirts, folding his socks, and leaving the newspapers next to the armchair. I still went to our small church group on Sundays where the pastor preached about forgiveness and the importance of being steadfast. He listened with the guilty concentration of a man who thinks he has been found out, but is hoping for forgiveness. When the front of normality was re-established, he found himself surrendering in a strange way. When men are left with nothing, they covet the most mundane comforts. Served something to eat or drink, washed off and helped to their rest in the house where the rain still sounds right on their roof. There were sleepless nights where I tossed and turned, picturing my behavior on a ledger of morals. I thought about coming clean completely, setting the devices aside, and letting the arc of consequence unfold. I thought of myself as the woman who empties out the house and moves on, leaving him to the consequences of his decisions. But the slow justice I had constructed was not strictly punitive, it was pedagogical in that surgical sense. I did not want him erased. I wanted him to pay attention, to understand the frailty of those relationships he had long assumed would always be there. I wanted him to understand how trust, once received, can so carelessly fall apart, and to maybe learn something he wouldn't have learned from a mere admission. His nervous breakdown didn't have one eventful moment. No fainting in a public square, no drunken confession in a restaurant. It was less noisy, and therefore more definitive. He started dropping balls, not writing down a signature when he should have, forgetting to pick up medication, being late for volunteer duties. His excuses, when he dragged his tardy limbs into the store, made some of those who had formerly envied his promptness to shake their heads. And I saw how the scaffolding of his beloved life, the invites, the little courtesies, the respect, would not return even when those rumors were long gone and postal sacks bearing no name or address failed to arrive at the clinic. Trust, once chipped, does not simply snap back into place like a china cup that has been glued. It remains a cracked thing, held together by a wrap of effort and apology. Months after that first email was read, the house felt changed. The air between us was as cool as a museum gallery. Donald walked through spaces with the tentative footfalls of a person afraid that any sudden movement would bring down some delicate thing. Haltingly, he attempted to apologize. He said things that, once upon a time, would have bowled me over. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I didn't think." I let him off with those words because they were less important than the truth of what he did, but also because it was part of my revenge to hand back his small chance of himself, if he could feel regret. It's an odd moral calculus to ask for both punishment and mercy, but life is seldom satisfied with binary options. People will often ask me if revenge made me better. The answer is complex because revenge isn't a bomb. It's an instrument for change. It would have set a balance in a ledger, to which I had been the dupe/creditor in loyalty and accuracy. It taught me that I could be resourceful, not just with code and maps but with the raw edges of life. And yet fall could not wipe away the ache of what had been lost. A life companion of years who might have become, eventually, a friend, an ally, a fellow architect of small tasteful things. There are nights when I am sitting at my kitchen table looking through pictures, Donald in a summer shirt, the two of us at a daughter's graduation, and there is this quiet grief. There is nothing that will bring back those smiles. And there isn't completely silenced the memory of laughter. Yet clarity comes after the storm. I started to lean back into myself in non-reactive ways. I got back into educating at the community tech workshop, teaching teenagers how to map a neighborhood and code an app with buttons that worked. The younger faces were seeking problems to solve. Victories of the structured sort that coding could provide. I felt pleasure in their advance, a purer, cleaner thing than the tangled ravening for pay. I mentored a young woman named Lila who was just like me, but younger. Intense, impatient, brilliant. Teaching her felt like refactoring a long-dormant system, stripping away cruft and adding features. Donald and I were still living under the same roof, because such practicalities often outlive passionate desires. He cared for the garden with a humility he had not known before, cutting back in a manner that seemed penitent. We spoke some words we had to speak, about bills and the plumber and whose turn it is to drive for their life at the dentist. Somehow we'd come to a silent agreement that was more honorable than the kind we'd had at 30. He stopped pretending he was perfect. I stopped pretending I was completely broken. There is dignity in admitting failure together, even if it comes late. In small and unexpected ways, the revenge did what it needed to do. It moved the axis of power in our home back to a position of relative balance. Donald stopped believing he could get away with anything. He developed, reluctantly and slowly, a sense of the human costs of his decisions. To be aware does not exonerate him. It no more changes what occurred, but it changes the future. In fact, as much of the future as futures can be changed. And I am older now, and smarter in quieter ways. One of the things I learned, agency can look very different from people elsewhere, and not all victories announce themselves with trumpets. Some are those measured closing of doors, that orderly reorganization of one's life, the gentle but firm insistence on protecting the space where you will spend your remaining years. Folks ask about you whenever I'm at the pharmacy or church bake sale. They know not of the design of the silent war I waged. Perhaps that is for the best. The ones that are told aloud devolve into caricatures. The reckonings lived privately remain, in a sense, sacred. I don't regret what I did. Not because I revel in causing pain, but because by doing so, I took back a sense of self that was nearly obliterated by someone else's selfishness. Sometimes I will not say revenge is a dish best served cold. Old proverb. But also forgiveness is the real victory. In my case, however, when love was over and the stab in the back had been administered, I was able to make sense of sorrow as a question resolved and a lesson learned without smothering all future prospects. There are nights when I hear the music through the walls of my house and think on all the chapters we have lived through. The young drafts of affection, middle years of habit, aged margins in which we write now our last passage. I'm under no illusions that my plan was pure or transcendent. Core to it was a reclamation. I am 71, and my hands still know how to make a useful something out of broken parts. Wednesday, June 7th, I head to the municipal park and think of maps and routes and how people get from one another. We are all desperately looking for a path that will protect us. Sometimes we need a winding detour. Sometimes we need a straight road to cut through the underbrush. Donald came to learn the cost of being gracelessly unfaithful at an age when it is more difficult, and when confidence does not allow for such choices. What I learned is that retribution can teach. Both of us learned that the past, once changed, can never return to what it was. That's not a tragedy but rather a redirection for me. I rebuilt. I taught. I loved in a new way, not with the blind hope of my youth, but with the cautious, firm grace of someone who knows what hurt looks like and uses that knowledge to both guard herself and help others find their way. They say when love is gone, revenge takes place. For me, it started with a minor, almost silent decision not to be reduced. It concluded with a new life. A life that wasn't intricately defined around the man whose betrayal of me I could not stop but whose absence in my tone, stance and stare made clear had been unable to break me. Now the maps I draw contain new lines. Paths that lead others out of places where trust becomes deadly. Tracks toward healing and the occasional, uncanny trail back to oneself.